a moment to locate your nearest emergency exit, and at this time, please stop texting and turn off your cell phone. Also, per JMU Health and Safety Guidelines, all patrons must wear a mask when in Wilson Auditorium. Following the presentation, there will be a question and answer session with our guest. Thank you, and enjoy the presentation.
Welcome and thank you for joining us. My opening remarks will be brief. My name is Dr. Taimi Castle, and I'm a professor in the Department of Justice Studies and also the interim director of the Gandhi Center at JMU. The Mahatma Gandhi Center for Global Nonviolence at JMU is housed in the College of Arts and Letters, and our core mission is to promote justice and nonviolence through education, scholarship, and engagement. Please visit our link tree in the program for more information about the center. We come together for this event, inaugurating the Beitzel Lecture Series. Sorry, hold on. There we go. Sorry, technical problems, user issue. So we come together for this event, inaugurating the Beitzel Lecture Series. The lecture series will bring distinguished scholars and practitioners of justice and nonviolence to JMU for public lectures, seminars, and panel discussions. The lecture series is named in honor of Dr. Terry Beitzel, professor, scholar, collaborator, co-conspirator, student, friend, son, brother, husband, and father. Terry also was a professor in the Department of Justice Studies and director of the Gandhi Center since 2014. Dr. Beitzel's scholarship explored the transitions between violent conflict and the role of justice and nonviolence in the lives of individuals and societies. You can find an exhaustive list of Terry's publications on the Gandhi Center website. But I did want to highlight the book, Service, The Path to Justice, because his co-author and dear friend, Dr. Calvin Redekop, was supposed to come. Is Cal here? No, okay. So he was unable to join us, that's okay. And now for special thanks and apologies in advance for anyone I've missed. This event would not have been possible without the support of Dr. Calvin Redekop, my Gandhi Center staff, Peggy Plass and Diane Falk, the Academic Unit Head and Program Support for Justice Studies, Provost Heather Coltman, Associate Vice Provost for Scholarship, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. She has a long title, Bessie Muhanja, Dean of the College of Arts and Letters, Robert Aguirre, JMU Civic, Aben Kara, Dan Harrison for making this happen, and Stephen Khalil for assistance with the live stream. We also want to say hello to Terry's family and friends in attendance, including his mother, Naomi, not here, his wife Sylvia and daughter Myra, as well as the family joining us via the live stream. We would also like to thank the family for allowing us to use the Beitzel bird shown in the program as the logo image for the lecture series, and also hello to Jim Moore. And now we'll hear from Dr. Margaret Sloan, who will introduce our speaker. She's the Director and Professor of Strategic Leadership Studies at JMU.
Thank you, Taimi. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this inaugural Beitzel lecture and to introduce someone who is very dear to me and I'm sure will be a benefit to all those in attendance this evening. Dr. Samiullah Nuristani came to JMU as an undergraduate student on a Fulbright scholarship and persisted through the Master's in Public Administration program and onto his PhD in Strategic Leadership Studies. Within each of these endeavors, he has consistently sought to understand and to bring understanding to political and social phenomena that are impacting Afghanistan and other post-conflict areas in the world. In his work life, he's held numerous leadership positions, as you note in the program, most recently within the Office of Head of State of the President of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. I've known Sami since he began his PhD journey. Although I served as his advisor and dissertation chair, as with many of my students, I feel like I learned equally as much, if not more, from him as he learned from me. I learned about his resourcefulness, his intellect, his humility, characteristics which you will see in abundance in the story he's about to relate. I also learned about the home of his birth, how its green hills are not so very different from the mountains that surround our valley, of the resourcefulness and self-sufficiency of its village farmers who have thrived for generations without governmental intervention. I also learned of its trials and dangers in walking a daily life in many practices that we in America take as given. For example, the threat of snipers targeting family and friends as they make their way to the ballot box, or armed soldiers scattered along the sidewalk as individuals were going about their daily activities to the grocery store or the pharmacy. Through our tenuous, sometimes tenuous phone connection when we were working on the dissertation document and he was in Kabul, I could hear the evening call to prayer ring out from the mosques in the capital city. Although there are many events taking place on the world stage today, and our hearts are certainly with those who are suffering under autocratic leadership in Ukraine and other countries, may we not forget those in Afghanistan, men and particularly women, whose human rights advances over the past 20 years have been crushed, as well as those who have fled to this country for protection from that regime. Leadership in complex environments should compel us to pay attention and maintain attention to issues that matter. Because as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminds us, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Dr. Nuristani's work reminds us to pay attention. Now, obviously, I am very proud of his academic work, but I am even more proud of who he is as a person, one who walks in integrity and whose quiet and persistent leadership provide lessons for us all. My life has been changed for the better because I know Sami. As we share in his research and his story this evening, may we all reflect on what leadership means in our own lives, and may we prepare our response to the hands and feet of peace. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Samiullah Nuristani.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for being here. I would like to thank James Madison University, and especially the Mahatma Gandhi Center for Global Nonviolence for providing me this opportunity to be part of Dr. Beitzel's lecture series. I had known Terry for several years. As a friend, he was a wonderful human being, a great teacher, above all, an advocate for peace. So I'm honored to be part of continuing legacy of Dr. Beitzel. So to understand the present, what is happening in Afghanistan, I think it only makes sense to go back a few decades to really uncover some of the context and some of the factors that collectively acted together to bring us some of the version of fundamentalism that we are witnessing, unfortunately, in the 21st century, especially in Afghanistan. So historically, I should go back to the British India and Afghanistan to just give you a little bit perspective. The Durand Line, part of that agreement between the British Empire in Afghanistan carved out a big part of land from Afghanistan, and that part was annexed to British India at the time. And this was a great source of contention for the Afghan rulers and the British Empire at the time. But it was somehow tolerated mainly because Afghanistan was used as a buffer zone between the Russian Empire of the time in the west or the north, and British India in the east. With the partition of India, and came a new state into existence by the name of Pakistan, which meant that it inherited part of the Durand Line, the part of the land that was carved out by the Durand Line Agreement. And it has remained since then a major source of contention between the Afghan rulers and the state of Pakistan. Especially the Afghan government, when Pakistan became a member of the United Nations, Afghanistan opposed openly, largely because it believed that it had taken a part of land that it belonged to Afghanistan. And throughout the history, Afghanistan rulers maintained that Durand Line was not an official border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. One of the reasons that Afghan leaders were convinced or motivated them was because the Durand Line basically split a major ethnic group in Afghanistan and put them into two different countries, specifically the Pashtun people of Afghanistan. And the Afghan rulers, they wanted to unify the Pashtuns so they would become a majority ethnic group in Afghanistan. And that dream, the unification of Pashtuns or Greater Pashtunistan, it had been alive in one form or the other in the Afghan history. And Prime Minister Dawood Khan, later President Dawood, he vehemently pursued that dream. When Pakistan came to existence, it was a source of major concern because in the 70s it had lost East Pakistan, which later on became Bangladesh. And now that the Afghan rulers were also pursuing the dream of Pashtunistan in the north or west of Pakistan, it was a major existential threat that the Pakistani state considered it. So there was back and forth between the two states. Dawood Khan, later in his life, he kind of softened his position, and by then he was already deposed by a communist regime that was supported by the then Soviet USSR. So there were two things happening at the same time in the latter half of the 70s. In Iran, we had the Islamic Revolution that had just toppled the last monarch of the Pahlavi dynasty. It was going down the right-wing conservatism. In Afghanistan, a left-wing movement had just toppled another monarchy. In Pakistan, General Zia-ul-Haq had just toppled a democratically elected Prime Minister, Bhutto. So Pakistan at this time was facing a major internal and external threat. The external was because it had lost a major part of its land. Internal because it had removed a democratically elected Prime Minister. So to unify the nation, General Zia wanted to portray the army as a united force, and to do that, he needed religion, specifically Islam, as the uniting element. And with that began the process of rapid Islamization of Pakistan. And to help that facilitate, what happened at the time was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It came at an ideal time for Pakistan Given the nature of the Cold War at the time, we knew, or we know now, Pakistan wanted to draw United States into that stage. And given the nature of Cold War, it seemed a compelling proposition for the United States as well. There were two reasons. One, to counteract the spread of communism that was pretty much taking over a lot of developing countries. And the second objective was to counteract the propagation of Shia Islam, that one of the most hostile or anti-American regime that had just come to power in Iran. So Pakistan used that to its strategic advantage. And it had two objectives. One, Pakistan always considered itself at a strategic disadvantage. To compensate for that, it resorted to a policy that internally they called strategic debt. The idea was basically Pakistan was never going to be powerful enough to confront sufficiently the Indian influence. So it needed its Western neighbor to be at minimum a friendly, if not subservient, regime. So the Cold War, the Russian invasion presented a wonderful opportunity for Pakistan. And it involved three, I would say, the three triangle: the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. Saudi Arabia would use its theological influence that it had on the Muslim world, and it would bring lots of fighters into Pakistan to convince or supplement the Afghan fighters that were already flowing into Pakistan. United States, on the other hand, through the CIA, was basically considered the quartermaster that was supplying arms, ammunition, in latest technology, and billions of dollars. And with this, we see billions of dollars flowing from Saudi Arabia into Pakistan. And this encouraged thousands of fighters from the Arab world to flow into Pakistan and join their Afghan fellow Muslims in their struggle against the Russian invasion. And we will see the implication of that influx of foreign fighters later on. Part of that movement that came into Pakistan was Osama bin Laden. In 1984, he came with blessing of the Saudi intelligence agency and the approval of Pakistani intelligence agency ISI. And he founded his first school in Pakistan. So these three elements essentially helped Pakistan achieve its objective. Internally, it used a lot of its religious organization or Islamic parties to oppress or counteract the growing discontent with the dictatorship. It also mobilized lots of madrasas, literally thousands of madrasas, which it served to this vast madrasa infrastructure served to produce foot soldiers for many years to come, not just in the 80s, 90s, but up until 2002. So to do that, Pakistan used the Afghan refugees that were flooding into Pakistan as its proxy forces to implement its strategic objective. And one of the things Pakistan did, a lot of the resources it received from CIA and the Saudi regime, It distributed mostly to the fundamentalist section of the Afghan freedom fighters or the Mujahideen. In any Afghan group that was to remain in Pakistan and receive that support that they drastically needed, they had to operate under one of the 7 designated Islamic parties in Afghanistan. It's interesting, you would think that forming a united front against the Soviet invasion would have been a much more appealing proposition, given the objective of, 1, defeating the Soviets, 2, establishing a pro-client regime in Afghanistan once the Soviets were dispersed and forced to leave Afghanistan. But somehow they, at the time, they considered it useful to just keep Afghan fighters not united, but scattered. So one of the reasons to do that was ISI wanted to maintain that control over that disparate and disunited groups. If the Afghan groups were to unite and act as one entity, it would have found, ISI would have found much difficult to influence them. In 1988, given the US support to the Afghan groups, especially the Stinger missile, the tide of war turned against the Soviets, and they believed it was no longer sustainable. There were some internal political shakeups as well, but largely they considered they were unable to sustain that war. So, and this perfectly created the opportunity for the Pakistani regime to install its client regime in Afghanistan. And to do that, they had convened a group in Peshawar to actually soon take over Afghanistan right after the Soviet withdrawal. And they actually organized about 10,000 fighters that was led by the Pakistani military forces, at least the leadership. And somehow they started from the Western Front or the Eastern Front, from, if you look from the Afghan angle, specifically the Jalalabad city. And it turned out to be a disaster for the ISI project and also for the Mujahideen. And at the time, United States felt really disappointed, given that they had spent so much resources on these disunited groups, and somehow they were unable to even topple a despot regime that no longer had the support of the Soviet army. Initially, later on, they established the Afghan unity government in 1992 that was designed to take over Afghanistan, and they were supposed to form a regime, a united regime. It never materialized, largely because once the Soviets were out, there was no longer an external threat that kind of united the Afghan people. Throughout history, Afghanistan somehow always, or the peoples of Afghanistan, needed an external element or a threat to kind of keep them united. And once that external threat was gone, they evaporated. That fake unity or that short-lived unity would evaporate. That's exactly what happened. So the ISI project was failing, and they needed to find another solution. With the Mujahideen engaged in civil war, what happened? Pakistan resorted back to its madrasa infrastructure that had been put in place in the early 80s. In madrasas, they were the perfect institution to create a new force for the Pakistani government to advance its agenda in Afghanistan. And Taliban were the ideal forces. Why? There were two important elements. One, they were detribalized, de-Afghanized, and they were trained in Pakistani madrasas with a foreign ideology that was completely alien to the Afghan people. And that was an ideal element for Pakistan to use that to their advantage. And Pashtuns, or the Taliban Pashtuns, somehow they were less interested in the ideal of Pashtunistan, and they were interested more in implementing a orthodox version of Islam, specifically Salafi Wahhabi Islam. By sponsoring the Taliban, Islamabad intended to transform Afghanistan into its client state and achieve its geostrategic and economic objectives. And that's exactly what they did. And so we have to also consider the fact that given that Cold War was over, USSR was no longer in existence, Pakistan was the only player at the time, and it could do all it wanted. The US was out of picture. And the other thing that happened, United States throughout the history has looked at Afghanistan from the Pakistani angle, from the Pakistan lens always. So once the Taliban came to formation, the United States had no presence in Afghanistan. All it did, it relied on reports from the Pakistani sources. And they convinced the US ambassador, US diplomatic staff in Islamabad that Taliban were the ideal alternative to the 7 Mujahideen parties, because they were involved in internal fightings, and the Taliban were going to put that to end. So with the capture of, they emerged in 1994. First they take over Kandahar, then within 2 years they take over Afghanistan. And I don't know how many of you were interested at the time or now to kind of look at what life under Taliban looked in the 90s in Afghanistan. And there are plenty reports you can resort to just understand what their ideology were. With their arrival, Afghanistan was already poor, but it was basically at the bottom of the poorest countries in the world. There was no longer women were allowed to leave their homes. They were cut off from the social, economic, and political life. There were no universities. There were no schools. There were no doctors. All they were interested were implement the draconian version of Islam. And you would think that given that Taliban had received a lot of mentorship and financial and material resources from the Islamic world, you would think that they would have learned a lot from other Muslim countries. But somehow the Islam that came to Afghanistan, it resembled none of the version that was implemented in its neighboring countries. Even the closest neighbor, Pakistan, the Islam in Pakistan was much different than the Islam in Afghanistan. In Pakistan, I grew up as a refugee in Pakistan. I could see girls were going to school. There were universities, co-ed universities, and there was no restriction on women's movement. We could see women in parliaments. We could see women as politician. Actually, Prime Minister of Pakistan was the first Muslim head of state or head of the government. But the version of Islam that Pakistan wanted to be implemented in Afghanistan was much different. And I don't know how that can be justified. So what happens in 2001, the fundamentalism, the infrastructure that was laid in the 80s, that came into action, and the first result we saw was the Osama bin Laden planned attack on the United States. With 9/11, everything changed, and the world has changed as we witness every day. So for the Afghan people, the overthrow of the Taliban was a new beginning, a new chapter, a new topic. It provided the foundation for a new democratic regime. It provided opportunities for building its institutions that were pretty much disintegrated, evaporated. It provided opportunity for the establishment of its security forces, a centralized government, an independent judiciary, an elected parliament, an elected president. Afghans experienced things in their lives, specifically experienced democracy for the first time. And for me, in my generation and the generation after me, that was a euphoric and exhilarating experience. And with the US engagement in Afghanistan, we could point several major strides that Afghanistan took. We could instantly see that women participation in life went up the roof. Men's participation in life, economy, health, literacy, everything improved. And these are some of the basic examples we saw. We had an elected parliament for the first time in the Afghan history. We had the president for the first time in Afghan history. So, August 15, 2021, I saw that with my own eyes. We witnessed the Afghan president fled, and somehow Afghanistan was pretty much a completely different entity to Afghans and the people that had supported the people of Afghanistan for 20 years. What happened? How come Taliban were so successful in coming back 20 years later and they fought their way back into power? What were the factors? Before going to that, I just want to give you a glimpse of what life looks like under Taliban.
سیاسی است از کشورهای منطقه هست که این طیف را قطعا به رسمیت نشناسن، قطعا مشروعیت نبخشن برشان. اصلا این شعارهای دروغین است. پیشتر ما یکی از طالبان رو می‌گفتم که از من فاصله بگی که خلاف شریعت است، اصلا قبول نکرد که برد. ما هرگز نمیگم، ما هرگز نمیگم به این راه ادامه نشیم. این ما صدای چند زن هستیم، ما صدای یک کشور هستیم، ما صدای زنای یک کشور هستیم. هرگز خاموش نمیباشیم. راه ما ادامه داره، هرگز خاموش نیستیم. حق خود میخواهیم، ما حق خود میخواهیم، ما حق خود میخواهیم، ما حق خود میخواهیم، ما حق خود میخواهیم.
Bear with me, there's one more video.
وقتی که اونا دفتر رسیدن متاسفانه حتی با آسانی راه رفتن نمیتونستن. در اکثریت نقاط بدن دو تا همکار ما آثار شکنجه و ضرب شتم دیده میشه. حتی در این جریان 4 ساعت بعضی یک از همکارا 4 بار از هوش رفته در حوزه سوم و ما به شفاخانه اینا رو منتقل کردیم و شفاخانه برای 2 هفته دستوری استراحت داده بر از اینا و در این حال اینا را دوا داده بر از اینکه درد و کوفتگی بدنشان میشینه. در جمع 5 همکار اطلاعات روز امروز توسط حوزه سوم طالبان در شهر کابل بازداشت شده بود که سردبیر اطلاعات روز شاملش بود.
Just to give you a context, those videos are at least 5 months old, and I tried to get some photos or videos that would reflect the current, but unfortunately I was unable. Those were, by the Taliban standard, were the golden times. No longer can you film, take photos, or capture video of Taliban in their action. It means a death sentence. So what happened? Why the Afghan government faltered? Why it disintegrated so rapidly? I want to focus on factors, and I want to divide it into internal and external factors, just to give credit to different actors. So in Afghanistan, ever since Afghanistan was founded with what we know current Afghanistan with its geographic boundaries in 1747. Despite it being a small country in terms of size and population, it's a very diverse country. And throughout its history, the Afghan rulers have been having a hard time to create a national narrative or something that would be acceptable to all people living in that country. One of the reasons is always there's 2 conflicting identities, and ethnic identity always supersedes and trumps the national identity. And that has been the major issue for a lot of Afghan rulers in terms of uniting the Afghan people around one unifying theme. Most other countries, nation states, have one unifying vision that brings its diverse people together, for which that ideal they try to work together and live together. Such an ideal in Afghanistan was hard to craft. And that goes to the second point, which is leadership failure. In Afghanistan, the leaders, people longed for a leader that would emerge and create a vision for the Afghan nation that would mobilize its diverse constituents around that vision. And so many leaders came in, and somehow they failed in framing that ideal for the Afghan people. In the absence of that national ideal, it's likely that ethnocentered, that tribalized identity comes into existence that overtakes other identities or supersedes. The second point with leadership failure I would like to mention is the leader versus managers. I guess in the leadership literature, we, at least I, as a student of leadership, there is a difference between a leader and a manager. And I kind of saw that play out in Afghanistan, that distinction, even though I had read a lot of literature, it wasn't as solid or as clear to me until I actually started working for the Afghan government in the presidential palace. So the difference to me was played out in the sense that instead of focusing a national issue that impacts all the people, regardless of their ethnicity or other identities, the Afghan president, he focused on running day-to-day affairs. For instance, let me give you an example. The president himself would be involved in promotion of its military leaders and its civilian leaders. In the military sector, for instance, if an officer was to be promoted beyond the rank of colonel, the president would have to approve that promotion, and he had to sign that himself. In the civilian sector, he got engaged in the same manner. Rank 1, which is the highest rank in the civilian sector, he would get involved in that promotion, which created a lot of obstacles for a lot of people. There were so many competent people, and somehow the president considered them not up to his standard. And a lot of times it wasn't because they were less qualified. It was largely his personal taste, style, and also he demanded 100% obedience. The president never tolerated criticism. There are so many instances, you might find videos that he would yell at his cabinet, during his cabinet meetings, yell at his ministers, yell at his 2-star, 3-star generals in public. And what that told people, the climate, the culture he created was 100% obedience, no deviation, no criticism. And that retarded creativity among the civilian sector leaders, among the military leaders. The next point I want to talk about is the grand corruption. It contributed a great deal to this disintegration. Corruption, based on the interviews I did with a lot of leaders, both in the executive branch and the legislative branch, also in the civil society groups. One of the main headache for the Afghan people that kind of compelled a lot of them to actually prefer Taliban over the Afghan government was corruption. There were so many cases, and there were some documentaries I think you could find on Vice, on YouTube channel, that they would go to different provinces and they would ask people, would you prefer your case to be resolved by the Afghan courts or the Taliban? And they found a lot of instances that people actually preferred the Taliban version. One, they didn't have to pay any bribe. Second, it was swift and expedited. They didn't need to resort to connections, all other things. And there were instances that some people would actually travel beyond the Afghan border just to resolve their disputes, because they were so fed up with the Afghan government. It had taken them years. Finally, they would give up. They would prefer actually their disputes to be resolved by the Taliban. So there are so many examples I learned during my interview. One of the example that stuck with me is the Afghan parliament is a bicameral. The House of Representatives is 100% elected, but the Senate, 1/3 of the Senate is appointed by the president, and which created a lot of opportunity for corruption. And there was one interviewee he mentioned, and he gave me some convincing examples. He said that the Senate position had their own price tag, depending which province you represented. Some province, they had price tag of $300,000 per appointment. And the same would go for in the executive branch. So the Afghan provinces, 34 provinces, they were divided into 3 different tiers. Tier 1, the highest, Tier 2, the next, tier 3, the next. So a Tier 1 government post was, it had a specific price tag, about $300,000, $500,000, and the lowest was about $200,000. So those were all the governors, and we could see why that was the case. What made me believe was rarely did we see new faces in the governorship position or cabinet position. Basically, the president reshuffled these cabinet members, these governors, from one province to the next. That was the extent of his innovation or implementing change at leadership level. So you would assume, at least there would be a natural question, why wouldn't you bring new faces or new leaders when these existing ones have not delivered the campaign promise that you had made to the Afghan people? And the question, the only logical, or the logical response that comes to my mind is basically these people pay a lot of money to remain in those positions. So, which the next point kind of feeds from that corruption, because if all you need is to pay the price tag, you're gonna get a lot of unqualified people. Most likely the qualified people may not have that amount of money to actually afford that, buying that seat. The next point is I witnessed that while working in the presidential palace. So the president himself did not believe in the existing institution. The reason I say that is because he created a parallel institution, the National Security Council, and then Office of Administrative Affairs of the Presidency. These 2 people, plus the president, these 3-man team pretty much ran the country. They bypassed all existing institutions. The National Security Council bypassed Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, National Director of Security. All the security sector related decisions were made by the National Security Advisor and his team. And when the government was disintegrating, there was one internal report that never got released. I actually did get to see it. In it, I did see, so the NSC had decided that it was gonna appoint all new district governors from taking personnel from MOD, mostly sergeant majors. They would appoint them as district police chief. So when they looked at the casualties, and there was a strong correlation between the casualty rate and the collapse rate and the number of these district police chief they had installed. In the civilian sector, it was the Office of the Administrative Affairs of the Presidency. They bypassed all other institutions, Ministry of Commerce, Ministry of Mines, Ministry of all ministries, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This one single entity, and it wasn't even a cabinet level position. It controlled all the appointment. So the people pretty much became fed up, and they thought this was a sort of dictatorship with the facade of democracy. And the other point, the president seemed insulated and largely out of touch with the public. And I'll share with my personal experience. When I work in the presidential palace, his quarter was very close. We could actually, it was 10, 15, 20 meters away. And anytime he would step out of his quarter, the Secret Service would come out. They would clear up the area. So God forbid if there's any employee within his office that would see him. So that kind of epitomizes the distance between the president, or the insulated nature of the president, and how people saw him as out of touch with the people. He could have easily came out and shook hands with his staff. And when he fled Afghanistan, exactly the same thing happened. He didn't have the courage to at least tell his staff, his close circle, that time was up, you need to leave because your life is in danger. He did not have the courage to do that, and he put a lot of people in danger. I do understand, I think there was a logic in him fleeing the scene, because we had seen in the 90s when Taliban first came to power, they executed the previous president. There was strong likelihood the same would have happened to him too. So at minimum, he could have at least tell his people to also depart. The other thing is the ANDSF, the Afghan National Security Apparatus. It lacked the national spirit. One, because the recruitment, the driving force behind joining the Afghan army wasn't patriotism. I'm not denying that there were a lot of people who did have patriotism. Certainly that's not the case. There were a lot of people, but a big chunk joined the Afghan army because their economic reason. The economy was the driving force behind their decisions. So devoid of patriotism, if money is all you have as the motivating factor, certainly you're not going to consider dying for that system a worthy cause. And the following related factor is the ANDSF purge. Under the guise of security sector reform, the president introduced a new plan under which he removed about 4,000 people, and lots of them were leadership level position. And that meant he pretty much purged the people he didn't like, and he brought his own people in the security sector. And security sector, and as the people in that field know, it cannot be ideal. Security sector has to be neutral. It can't be subservient to the whims of the presidency. They're supposed to defend the nation. And the elite in the rural public, that gap was very evident given the massive amount of money that went to the pockets of specific individuals at the top leadership. And the poor in the rural area, they rarely got the money that was allocated to those development projects, and they resented those facts, and they hated. In this part, I would like to talk about the external factors that also contributed to the disintegration of the Afghan army and the Afghan government. So one, the externally imposed systems. Over the last 4 decades, Afghanistan experimented with 3 different and often competing systems. With the Soviet invasions, we saw the imposition of communism. With the Taliban in the 90s, we saw the imposition of theocracy. In 2001, one of the major criticism about the post-Taliban regime is the leader of that entity was handpicked by the United States. And Karzai, before that, He wasn't a known figure. He wasn't an intellectual. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't a civil society activist. He wasn't a known figure that would have strong grassroots support. He was handpicked. And the same goes with Taliban. It was an externally imposed. The Afghan people didn't want it. With the Soviet invasion, the same thing. So these externally imposed systems tend to be unsustainable. The second most strongest factor, I think, is the Doha Agreement. So with Doha, before going to the specific of the agreement, it did a few things. One, because the Afghan government was entirely excluded from that negotiation. And if you go back to 2001 with the Bonn Agreement, the same thing happened. A major party to the conflict was excluded, specifically the Taliban. And now 20 years later, you're reversing everything and you're trying to bring the Taliban back to power, eliminating the regime you invested so expensively over the last 20 years. So it killed the spirit of the Afghan people. The Afghan government, it was demoralized, and it legitimized Taliban as the future regime. And the impression that was created in Afghanistan, they said, well, America is going to bring Taliban no matter what. So the ANDSF took it as a way, well, lay down your arms. Why fight when the US has already signed to bring Taliban back to power? And if you go, I did read the agreement. It never mentions that Taliban would have to talk to the Afghan government. It never mentions the Afghan government in any of the 4 pages. At minimum, it would have asked, well, one of the requirements is you have to, now you sign this agreement with the US, you have to sit down and sign a separate agreement with the Afghan government. Never. The only term they used was intra-Afghan dialogue. And you take it however you mean it. It could mean anything. You could sit with 2 people and that could be considered intra-Afghan. And the other thing with the Doha Agreement, US, it made a huge concession. Number one, 5,000 Taliban fighters were to be released immediately, followed by another 1,000. So I was there with I arrived in Afghanistan right after that agreement was signed. So what that did, it released a lot of the fighters, and they pretty much took position within the Kabul city. And right after that agreement, there were targeted assassination of Afghan officials day and night, left and right. Every day, I witnessed myself down a few streets down where I lived. The bus stop or the taxi stand I took, there were assassination of Afghan officials every day. And how that became possible? It was largely because you gave them a huge force of 5,000 people instantly, and they didn't need to go out. They just need to live in the city and carry out their assassination. And the other thing comes back to the madrasa infrastructure. The infrastructure that was built in the 80s and 90s, it produced sustainable foot soldiers to the Taliban, the anti-Afghan government elements for the past 20 years. So they didn't have to worry about their new recruits. They had a steady supply. And another important point is the Durand Line. What happened, most Afghan leaders tend to ignore that because number one reason, most Afghan presidents somehow, I don't know why, even the US believes, the British Empire at the time believed that they must come from a certain ethnic group. And that ethnic group, Pashtun, they always pursued the greater Pashtunistan ideal. And that was a legitimate concern for the Pakistani state. They considered that an existential threat to them. So they always overlook that part, the Durand Line. Somehow they never talk about it. But that was a major player into what caused the disintegration of the Afghan government. You ignore a critical problem and then you hope that it will go away, but it doesn't. So the lessons and implication: in the 90s, we saw US left in a great vacuum was created, and regional actors came in, filled that void. And what did we get? We got Al-Qaeda, we got 9/11. The same thing, this time only more powerful and more potent force of the Taliban. What is different this time? The difference is they're much more sophisticated, they're technologically literate. Above all, they have $80 billion worth of American weaponry in their hands. And the second thing I would like to mention is, with the situation ongoing currently in Ukraine, it makes us really hopeful and really optimistic about the human nature that the international community had stood together in solidarity with Ukraine. And I would like the same for the Afghan people. They must not be forgotten, because one of the myths, the international community is to a certain degree, was part of that creation of that myth, and it does bear some of the responsibility, if not a major portion of it. And another issue related is one of the mistakes that the West makes is they look at Afghanistan from the Pakistan angle, and it gives you a distorted view of the Afghan people. And it has always been the case, and this needs to change. In funding a group that you think is the enemy of your enemy, especially insurgent groups, is a risky business. Just because the Mujahideen were anti-Soviets doesn't mean they're gonna fight for your ideal. And we saw how that played out. The people who fought against the United States and the NATO forces were the very people that the US armed them in the 80s, 90s. In Taliban, another mistake we should avoid, we should not be naive enough to consider Taliban as a reform or rejuvenated element. It's not. The reality certainly will give you a completely different picture. As we speak, Afghanistan is under a total blockade. Nobody can leave Afghanistan. Even American citizens, I know right now, they cannot leave Afghanistan. There are so many American citizens, so many permanent residents, so many Afghans that work for the US forces, NATO forces, they're stuck there, and they're being hunted down every day. There is ongoing house-to-house search in the capital, and a lot of people are being assassinated, and they disappear every day. And I tried to get some photos. As I said earlier, it's nearly impossible. And the other thing, the West, the international community, must never recognize Taliban as a legitimate representative government of the Afghan people, because they're not, they're a proxy force waging an external government's war in Afghanistan. And there must be some sort of mechanism that the West employs to leverage in order to compel them to form a broad-based government. And there are lots of leverages that the United States and Western countries can certainly use that. And women's rights, minorities' rights must be protected. As we know, some of the major victims of the Taliban resurgence are women and minority groups. And we have seen that play out. A lot of women disappear. Even in the shelter houses, the safe houses that the US tries to use them and eventually use those to evacuate, they're being raided, and a lot of women disappear. Minorities, the same, be it religious or ethnic minorities, the same thing. They're being targeted. So when the Taliban were fighting the Afghan government, there were some elements of minority groups in them. What we have learned lately is that they have even purged those non-Pashtun elements from their ranks. Thank you for your time.
Hello? Oh, there we go. Okay, maybe I just need to stand in front of it. So we're going to open it up for questions right now, so feel free to come up to the microphone over here or this one as well, and obviously you need to speak directly into it or it doesn't work. But while we're waiting for someone to ask a question, Dr. Nuristani, maybe can you speak a little bit? You mentioned that the Taliban is technologically literate now. What does their PR campaign look like currently?
I went to their website, and you can look there. It's not censored, and you would be amazed the amount of propaganda they put out. So with the house-to-house raid, the way how they legitimize that, well, they say we're after thieves, robbers, and the elements that cause disturbance in the public order. That's how they justify. In reality, because I know some of my relatives, friends, they have been hunted down. So they're monitoring WhatsApp. That's one of their technological sophistication. And I have learned that they pretty much listen to all the conversation that is happening through WhatsApp. And WhatsApp is the preferred medium of communication in that part of the world. And the way they polish their image, it's astounding. And if you just listen to their propaganda, you would assume, oh, they're certainly a reformed version of themselves. So they're really savvy. And the credit goes to their handlers, certainly.
So someone is coming up here, so while they're en route, can you, for the folks joining us who may not be familiar with Afghanistan and where Nuristan is in location, that may not know about other provinces, can you talk a little bit about the uniqueness of Nuristan?
It's on the border with Pakistan. It's in the northeast, so if you look at the map, I should have put a map like somewhere here, northeast, below Badakhshan, between Badakhshan, Kunar, and Panjshir provinces. It's right on the border, has a tiny border with Pakistan. There's a river, that river separates, kind of function as a natural boundary between Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Nuristani. My question is, since August, there have been a lot of conversations from think tanks and international groups saying, what's next? What are the next steps? From you listening to these conversations, are you in agreement with these next steps, or what do you think that we may be missing in those conversations? Thank you.
Next step, I think there isn't a consensus as to what that next step is. So several propositions, and I think they're leaning on unfreezing some of the assets and giving them some sort of access to resources, so at least they can pay their staff, the bureaucracy to function. To me, I think it should be conditional. So any resource that gets to the Taliban, it's going to only embolden them and also give them international legitimacy. Even though no country has yet recognized them, but the mere unfreezing of assets, giving them that resource gives some sort of legitimacy. So one of the logic they use is we don't want the Afghan people to starve, certainly not. And ideally, I think whatever resource they're unfreezing, there should be a mechanism that people actually receives that aid money or the Afghan resources rather than the Taliban leadership. Because what they do with that money, they use that as a leverage, and they say, well, this is our money, and they only distribute amongst their fighters. When they took over the government, one of the first things they did, they called up all their suicide bombers, the family of the suicide bombers, and they gave them a huge amount of cash prizes. It kind of basically defeats the purpose of creating an accountable regime.
Hi, Sammy. You had mentioned the problem of viewing Afghanistan through the Pakistan lens. Could you elaborate on that, what that looks like?
Yes. If we go back to the 80s and 90s, so a lot of the decisions that the United States made with regards to Afghanistan, they were based on most of the assessments they received from the Pakistani sources. With the Cold War, what had happened, the CIA and ISI, they established a strong partnership. And it did work, certainly, it did work. So there was a huge amount of trust, and that influenced a lot of the input that they were it made the input they received from Pakistan much more reliable. So with the Taliban, I'll give you an example. The deputy chief of mission at the time, he said, well, life was really not that bad under Taliban, and the people of Kandahar would be crazy not to live under Taliban theocracy. But if you lived or you knew the people who lived under Taliban, it was not so bad. It was a disaster. So those are just some of the examples. And there are so many resources I can certainly point to if you would like in depth. They're incredible resources. They have discussed in detail, not just hearsay with some rigorous research.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. I'm wondering what you see the future truly with Pakistan's involvement. As I know you know, the ISI head of Pakistan was the first delegate to visit the Taliban after they took control of Kabul. We know that the Biden administration signed an executive order for half of Afghanistan's national reserves held in New York to be given to 9/11 victims, which Afghanistan had nothing to do with, and the other half to filter through humanitarian resources, undetermined, undefined. I see this looking much like 1994 to 2001, where Afghanistan existed in isolation and misery, forgotten by the rest of the world. Do you think at this point in time, because it is a different context, that Pakistan will be able to install a stronger proxy government force with the Taliban in Kabul because of the isolation that is going to be rampant and the mass starvation that's occurring right now? Or do you think that the own Taliban factors with TPP in Pakistan are going to keep that tension with ISI in Afghanistan?
There is a parallel, certainly. It looks like President Biden has pretty much given up on Afghanistan. I don't know why. And it's with the unfreezing of the Afghan reserve, it defies logic as to how he came to that decision. As I said, it's looking to Afghanistan through the Pakistan lens. First, where was bin Laden first? Where did he establish his madrasa? It was Pakistan. Who was he supported by? ISI. Where was he killed? In Pakistan. And how many Afghans were amongst the 19 hijackers, 0. And somehow, I think the families of the 9/11 victims, certainly they deserve to be compensated, but I don't see the connection. You had to make a huge jump to get to that conclusion, and I don't see any linking elements that justify that decision. And with the Afghan isolation, I do see that there is likelihood that Pakistan maybe this time around be able to implement actually realize its strategic depth policy. But again, I do believe that externally imposed systems on Afghanistan have never worked. That's what keeps me hopeful. And the Afghan people certainly don't consider the Taliban as indigenous people. Certainly they're not. And first thing, they do not know the Afghan culture. A lot of Afghans, even in the West, they at least study the Afghan culture. They grew up listening to, hearing, or reading about it. But the bulk of the Taliban, they were trained in Pakistani madrasas, curriculum design in Saudi Arabia, in Arabic countries, in Islamabad. It had nothing, they never offered anything about Afghanistan, so they became so de-Afghanized and really distant from the Afghan reality. So the Afghan people certainly don't consider the Taliban as indigenous people, and that makes me hopeful that it's not going to be sustainable. But there's a tacit approval, and I think that's a travesty and against the Afghan people. Why? I have no idea. Well, it's a poor country, certainly, and resources do play. It's not closely culturally related to Western countries. There's so many factors that tend to seem that fake distance that make people less sympathetic to the people of Afghanistan. And what really made me optimistic with, as I said earlier, with the case of Ukraine, that's amazing. And I wish if the Afghan people had received 10% of that solidarity from the international community.
Dr. Nuristani, thank you so much. Wonderful to see you here today. My question is prompted by something you just were saying very recently in your response. What about the regionalism in Afghanistan? There are different regions, there are different ethnic groups, the Tajik, the Kyrgyz, the Turkmen, these more northern outlying areas from the traditional Pashtun areas. I'm just wondering, is there potential for pulling away and creating more difficulties for the Taliban to maintain control of all of the country in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. I think, yes, social cleavages, they do exist, and some are stronger than others. And ethnicity is one of those prominent ones. There is talk of, I think, partition of Afghanistan. There is a possibility because what the non-Pashtun ethnic groups see is a blatant attack on their identity, on their culture, on their way of life by the Pashtun majority or Pashtun-dominated Taliban. And the only way around they see is a partition along ethnic lines, or Pashtun versus non-Pashtun ethnic groups. And that issue kind of was exacerbated by the structure of the post-Taliban governance system that was laid in Bonn Agreement. A lot of non-Pashtun groups, they wanted to create a federal structure in Afghanistan, given the diverse nature of the Afghanistan. There are so many ethnic groups, and if you have a strong centralized government, you're gonna pick the dominant culture as the more representative or dominant force that's gonna be considered imposed by the non-Pashtun groups. There are so many differences. For instance, non-Pashtun people, they're very okay. They actually want their girls to go to school. But if you go to Kandahar, Helmand, they don't want their girls to go to school. So if you're to make a policy, a national education policy, which one are you going to pick? So the federalism was pretty much shot down by the United States in Bonn. They campaigned so hard, but somehow the United States did not think it was a good idea for a federal system, despite the US being a federal system and functioning really well. And I think that issue of partition of Afghanistan kind of, it does give some credence to that possibility that it may happen, because there's zero support to the Taliban regime by non-Pashtun ethnic groups. Even majority Pashtuns don't like them. But the only thing, they can't express their views because either you get killed or you get put in jail and you disappear all of a sudden.
Any other questions before we wrap up here? Dr. Nuristani has put his email address up there, so feel free to email him with any personal questions. And I also want to personally invite any one of you to come by the Gandhi Center, which is across the quad here in Darcus Johnson 1005. Not right now, we won't be there. But during the day, some other time, feel free to stop by. We have a faculty peace station set up there, but everyone's welcome to come and have a cup of tea and a snack. Thank you guys for coming. Have a great evening.